Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. We are rolling on another episode, another week with somebody who I'm going to tell you why I'm a little bit excited about this episode and show you in a second. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I sit on today, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who happen to be joining in and watching us today, either live or on the replay. Particular acknowledgement and respect to you. Lisa, whose land are you coming in from today?
I'm on Muanina country today, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders.
Thank you. We haven't had that country before, so it's been like this going around the country during this show, which I realised this morning has now almost been exactly a year that I've been doing this for, so it feels like a little momentous. And it's interesting, we were just talking, Lisa, about the types of people who I've been asking to get on this show. And originally the show was designed to create a platform and space for people who weren't getting to have their voices heard, in terms of people who were working in inclusion, who were at the grassroots doing, the hard things, having those challenging conversations with managers within workplaces or sporting clubs or whatever it may be. And I did a bit of a reflection this morning on all the people who had come through and spoken, and feel such a privilege to be able to have met all these people and to have heard their stories. But I don't want to in any way undermine the value in your voice either, because you have been somebody who's come up as such a strong voice in the inclusion space, particularly around STEM. I'm going to let you tell your story, as I do with all my guests. But every night when my youngest is here, we sit and we read a page from your book. And Sky absolutely adores this. And we really get into it, and I'm learning as much. I have a science background, but I tell you what, some of this stuff had completely missed me in my years of education. And this point that I'm sure people are going to be interested in, if you haven't retained this piece of information, if you and a friend both look at a rainbow while standing side by side, you will actually see two completely different rainbows. I know that's a simple fact, but that had escaped me throughout all my chemistry days.
Well, Bree, if I can teach you any rainbow facts, I'll be very happy to do so.
I am loving it. We have totally adored it. So thank you for providing that to our lives. We've also got some comments already in the chat, so if you feel like commenting, if you have any questions, go ahead. But before we do any of that, as usual, Lisa, I'm going to ask you to tell your story. You are the ambassador for women in STEM. How did you get here, and why?
That's a really good question, Bree, and await the War and Peace version of my life. But it's interesting to reflect, isn't it, how you get where you are and what you wanted to be when you grow up and all that kind of stuff. And I was very lucky. I actually had quite an unusual upbringing. My mum and dad brought me up, but in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up as a young kid, it was quite unusual for the dad to stay at home. And my dad was looking after the kids at home. My mum went out to work. So I had a kind of unusual kind of upbringing for the time. It's not as unusual now, but still fairly unusual in opposite sex couples. And, from my mum being a great role model as a head teacher, someone who went out for work, ran a school, was very accomplished. And my dad being a really smart guy and really compassionate kind of guy, and raising three kids at home. And after primary school, I actually had the opportunity to learn at home, to teach myself instead of going to school. So from the age of 11, me and my brother and sister both independently selected that choice. So we actually stayed at home. So it was kind of an unusual period growing up. It was great fun. I was like highly motivated and excited to learn. We'd always grown. We didn't have much money growing up, but just enough to have things like, a house full of books, and, to have the opportunity to do like music lessons and that kind of stuff. So, I was really surrounded by kind of a love of learning. And I think that's where I sort of stumbled upon astronomy as my career, looking up at the stars and falling in love with nature. We just spent our days going on bike rides and climbing trees and, walking around talking about nature and why is that rainbow happen? Like, how does that happen? Why is that river bendy here but straight in another place? Why does the tree grow like this in this direction? Because of the winds. And we were just asking questions and talking and, I guess, philosophizing. And that's how I grew up. So I wanted to be like the great thinkers, the learners that I'd read about in books. And I stumbled upon astronomy, as I said, and just fell in love with it. So I went back to formal education age 16 and did all my exams that were necessary to go to uni and studied astronomy. So I became an astronomer. I loved doing research and, I loved working in teams and helping to build new telescopes and develop international projects, working in different countries. My first job was, after my PhD, was in Holland. So I finished my PhD on the Friday, handed it in, went across to Holland, and started work on the Monday in another country. So, I was always keen to sort of explore and learn new things and learn from different cultures. But I did notice, I must say, growing up, I was always a tomboy. I was very sort of, male aligned in my mind. And, I didn't have a problem with that at home, but certainly with other people, grown-ups in particular, they had a problem with that. And I noticed as well a lot of sexism, I suppose, when I started doing my PhD, and a certain sort of aggressive male macho culture that was pervading that environment. And I didn't like it. I suppose I went along with it maybe, but because it was easier. But, I started noticing that kind of that sexism as I started doing my PhD and then into my career. And I noticed different working environments. In the Netherlands, it was very professional, very international. Moved to other environments, it was very much less so, maybe in the university sector, and in other jobs that I had subsequently. And I started noticing, the gender pay gap and reading about things that really affected women and other groups. And at university as well, I was the LGBT officer, became LGBT officer at the student union, and was helping people to talk about the problems they were having coming out to their family and the problems they were having maybe being cut off financially because of their sexuality or their gender identity. So just noticing that I was caring about social justice, and I was noticing that things were not equal for people. So I guess I started caring about the world, through those processes, through the education and outreach I was doing with people at university. And I guess that started coming into my mind as I was in workplaces that had really bad cultural practices. So I became the head of the Women in Astronomy chapter for the Astronomical Society of Australia, our professional body, and decided to do something about it. So we actually got together and we set up an Athena Swan style program called the Pleiades Awards in Australia. And every single astronomy research institute in Australia is signed up to this charter now. And it's been going for, 6 or so years. And it's about self-reflection of organizations and looking at practices, looking at culture, and making concrete plans to change and to improve those cultures and practices. So that's kind of how I got into the D&I side of things. I'm working on the SAGE, the Science in Australia Gender Equity program as well within my previous employer. And, as a manager of 30 people in my previous job, I was working hard to improve culture and practices there too. So a lot of D&I work, of course, never was part of my core business. I was always, a scientist, but, it was, as always, it's, people who are marginalised often get to do the work for free. Thanks very much. And there we go. And we're doing the work. So it's it sort of brought me to a point where, when the Australian government announced that they were looking for an ambassador, and I was approached because I'd done this type of work and have been talking about these issues publicly, and I was invited to take up the position. So now it's my full-time job, and I have a team who are really fantastic and support me in doing the work, doing the research, doing the policy work with government, and working with educators, young people, running education campaigns and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really exciting job and a great role to try and make change on a national scale. It's a real privilege, actually.
Amazing. Before I ask you my detailed question, we've got a question from a 7-year-old. Can your books have more pictures, please?
All right, I'll do it. Sounds good.
So that's the important stuff out of the way.
The pictures are the good stuff, yeah.
They are. Pictures are the good stuff. So I want to kind of track back then. You said that you were noticing sexism and bad behaviours in the workplace. What do you think you saw then that now you wouldn't see?
Okay, so that's easy, but only in certain workplaces. So things I was seeing was overt sexist comments and jokes, like really bad off the scale ones, and naked calendars on walls, like literally that bad. I had also, when I was a PhD student, I had a picture of the women who were astronomers in the 1800s, but they weren't called astronomers. They weren't allowed to be called that, so they were paid very poorly, and they were called computers because they did the calculations for the astronomers. So these women were called the Harvard computers, and I had a picture of them, like a nice black and white picture on my wall. And one day, the guys, who was known to be pretty sexist and terrible, he scrawled "get back in the kitchen" on my picture. And this is, a 30-something-year-old man in a workplace. Just that kind of really overt sexism, I think, is probably less tolerated in many workplaces, but certainly not all. And I think I would see that less, certainly in the types of workplaces I'm in now, like university sector and research sector. And in industry, hopefully that would not be seen as acceptable. But the other things, of course, are the much more subtle things, and culture is very complex as well. Of course, it's if you are a member of the dominant culture, you don't even realize there's such a thing as culture. You just don't see it. It's like a fish in water. They don't see the water. That's just where they live. But when you're, say, a white person in a workplace that's dominated by white people, you don't notice that there is a particular culture there that would be potentially quite hostile to other people. So, as you live in different countries, as you work with different people, and as you read more and learn more about D&I, you actually realize that culture is a very powerful and all-pervasive thing. It's a bit like dark energy in the universe. It causes the expansion of the universe. It's everywhere. It's in every corner, and you don't necessarily notice it if you're not affected negatively by it.
That's so on point at the moment, particularly in Victoria, where there's a whole bunch of public service organisations currently madly analysing data from the gender equality workplace audits that they're doing. The questions that's asked in the survey to all their employees is there a positive culture towards people from different cultural backgrounds in this organisation? And the next question is there a positive culture towards people with disability in this organisation? And it goes on and lists them. I have issues with the question for starters, but the responses that you see are just fascinating. You know, that
who are they asking? Who are they asking?
They're asking the majority, right? So they're asking
at the top.
The people from those minority marginalised groups, their numbers are so small, their answers don't even get reported, right? Because their sample sizes are too small. And so we're asking about this positive culture, and it's exactly what you see. They don't see what they don't experience. And so they say, The interesting thing's been, though, that for people with disability, most of the responses that I've seen actually show that people don't believe there's a positive culture for people with disability in their organisation. And I don't know what drives that and why that's different, but I think that's interesting. But I digress. You said something earlier about the weight of the work, or the work being done by the minority and marginalised people. And this is a really complex issue, right? Because people from minority and underrepresented groups should be the voices that are being heard in this space. But then there's this line that we constantly seem to step over, where we're asking people to do this inclusion work for free. I just had an example last week where somebody reached out to me. They're a trans woman in an organisation, and they've been asked to provide advice on what they can do in terms of diversity and inclusion, and that's not their area.
That's not appropriate. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because for example, at a previous workplace, it was always the marginalised groups doing the work. Where at Purple Day, we'll get Lisa to do the talk because she's gay. It's like, well, actually, there are professionals who can help with workplace change and positive cultural changes, and there are professional organisations who can run workshops, as opposed to getting rolling out the local gay, like literally it's so superficial, and it doesn't get to the heart of what we're actually trying to do here and what we're trying to achieve, which is to make workplaces genuinely inclusive. Having a pink cupcake does not do that. And having a conversation, well, frankly, where only the people turn up who are interested, or probably allies, that does not culture change. So, if you want to do the work as an organisation, if you are a manager, if you are a leader in an organisation and you want to make change, you've got to get people. Self-organising is good because you can create safe spaces, and you can create a sort of a leadership group of people who are affected by poor culture. Pretty much everyone's affected by poor culture, but people who are the most affected to drive change. But better still, you can get someone like you in and actually try and fix and assess what's wrong in the organisation, and actually try and fix these things. You're either getting to the heart of the issue, or you're just you're superficial. You're kind of playing at equality, playing at inclusion, and it's very annoying to see actually the corporatization and the superficial nature of these kind of days of observance throughout the year, and I do find that quite problematic.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Trying to flip it around a bit. What are you seeing as best practice in the spaces that you're working in? What are you seeing that is perhaps new, innovative, that's really creating change?
Yeah, there's quite a lot actually, and I think having a structure is really useful. So for me, organisations taking part in not just compulsory reporting to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, or if you're in Victoria, the new arrangements there, but also things like SAGE, Science in Australia Gender Equity, which is if you don't know, it's an organisation where people sign up in the higher education and research sector, and they look very carefully at their organisational practices, and they make a very specific plan with measurable outcomes. They have a timeline, and they actually change policies. In my work with my team, Isabel Kingsley, the research associate in my office, is leading some work to really embed a culture of evaluation in D&I and also in education programs that are trying to get more women and marginalised people in STEM, in science, technology, engineering and maths. So what we're doing is telling people how to evaluate the outcomes of a program, how to design a program with specific outcomes in mind. And I think we have to get a bit more scientific in the way we're doing this, and make sure that we're measuring that specific measurable outcomes always. Otherwise, we're tinkering around the edges. And if you're not changing a specific practice, if you're not looking at hiring, how do you hire people more inclusively? How do you look at your requirements for a job and say which ones are actually really necessary? Do you need a forklift truck driver's license, or can you learn on the job? Do you need this specific qualification? Do you need even using words like outstanding and leader and striving, and there's certain gendered words that actually put women off applying for jobs. And that is, scientifically founded. We know that, and we can avoid doing that. And we can teach people things on the job as well to avoid the sort of gendered background expectations that we have. I saw a recent job advert for vice chancellor at a university, and it said, you need to have world-leading global reputation in academia with outstanding publication record. And already we know from research that publication record and citations are very gendered. Men self-cite more, they cite other men more for the same quality of work. And, these things are gendered, so you're setting women up to fail and other groups to fail by setting these specific expectations. You're not lowering the bar if you don't set those expectations. You're just being more creative, and you're giving people a chance who have the potential, who have the capability to do that job really well and to bring new perspectives in. So it's about being less rigid, being more flexible, and actually thinking, is this necessary for this job? And that's the key, really, I think, in growing stronger, more innovative workplaces and teams.
And what a great example, like in terms of a vice chancellor needing to have a high, a strong publication record. I'm not
irrelevant. That's irrelevant.
Helping them with the job that they're doing in any way, shape or form.
You're just saying we want an old white male professor. That's literally what they're saying.
Yeah.
And they don't realise they're saying it, and that's the sad thing. And that's what they get.
Yep. And that absolutely is true across industries. And I'm commonly talking to clients about, what really is required in this role. Why is that necessary? And I think that was one key takeaway out of a session I was participating in recently, was ask the question, just keep asking why. And then we get to the bottom and understand what is really important and what's not.
And in my own team, look, we're every time we advertise for a job, we're looking at how we can make it more inclusive. And we're not perfect, and no one will ever be, but we're trying every time to just question. And we used to say, for a managerial job, it was just sort of automatic for my broader organisation that you would need a degree for this job. And I said, well, why do you need to have a degree? Like, literally, why? There's no reason. You need to be able to do X, Y, Z, but you don't have to have a degree. So I took that requirement out, and secondly, my COVID aside, before COVID, I said, well, why do people have to work from Sydney? Why can't we get the best candidate from anywhere in Australia? So we started advertising all our positions flexibly from any location within Australia, and great, get the best team.
Absolutely. And it's even post-COVID, it's
So
still hard to convince people that that's a legitimate way of working. People are still wanting to get candidates that are in their city that can actually go into the workplace. And but you're right, it's simple things that we just need to be doing more of, and speaking more loudly that we're doing this and this works. It's positive. That's brilliant. If you've got any more questions for Lisa before we wrap up, please do. Some of the key takeaways for me are definitely that people who are a part of the majority culture don't see the culture. So if the culture is working for you, you don't see it. That we're still putting too much weight on the shoulders of people from minority and marginalised groups, absolutely. And I really like the conversation around the what you said about what you see then and what you see now. And we know that a vice chancellor actually said to me once, back in the 70s and 80s, it was actually easier to deal with sexism because it was overt. It
obvious.
Was so obvious. It was, people would tell me, they would say it in a meeting. It was out there. Now it's still there. It's just more difficult to manage.
And it's subtle, and there's a kind of the subtle comments, and I was subjected to one in a board meeting a couple of weeks ago, about this sort of, I guess, typecasting women's and men's opinions and grading them. I myself and another woman gave our opinions on a matter that we were discussing in the board, and then a male member of the board gave an opinion, and someone else commented that the man's opinion was, well considered, and the women's were emotional. And it was just a classic example of that pervasive sexism that isn't, that go and make me a sandwich, that overt, absolutely glaring sexism, but it's sexism still, and it's denigrating women. It's reducing the impact of their opinions and their expertise, and it's still there, and it's happening today.
We've got a question from Sally. Hi, Sally. Good to see you, that you're listening in. How do we deal with organisations that put a couple of women, usually white, Anglo, in leadership and then say it's all fixed? We have diversity.
Well, that's asking the $64,000 question, and that's pretty much every organisation, isn't it? It's absolutely spot on point. And I must say, it takes a different kind of leader to come in and say this isn't enough. Bree, you and I were just talking about intersectionality before we came online, and a lot of that is all talk at the moment. I feel that very acutely, and how I feel myself as a woman from England and Anglo background is just, it's so easy to take up so much space. I'm bombarded with requests to talk about things and to give my opinion, and that's what we see in society. We give the same people a platform, and I'm absolutely guilty of that and very aware of that. And you may have valid opinions, but then they're not 10 times more valid than other people's, and that's how much airspace you get. So it's about in leadership, I guess, making space for others, and it's something I constantly have to be aware of, and often saying no to things and actually giving other people an opportunity is something that I think we can all do better if we're in a position where we're often asked, to be platformed.
Yeah, great points. And I had that very thing happen 2 weeks ago. I got asked to speak on a panel for, I think it was Wear a Purple Day. And I did ask, is there any cultural diversity on the panel? And at that point there wasn't. And they saw that as quite an off-the-cuff question. They didn't expect it. By the time the panel came around, there was. But we need people to be thinking much more strategically about that. And it's certainly been something that I've been trying to work very hard with on this show, so that you are listening in and you know of voices that aren't getting the platform that could really make a lot of use of this half hour once a week, please let us know. You know, we're always keen for more guests. And one of those guests was Gloria, who came on recently, who was incredible. If you haven't seen her episode, please jump on and have a look at that, because she's got some really important things to say, messages that we need to hear. Now we're right on 12:30, so we need to wrap up. I don't go after over time for anyone. Just in the meantime, I'm glad that you were happy to just sign the book right then. So yeah, thanks for the signature.
Yeah, no worries.
That was great. Sky will be happy. Thanks for coming on, Lisa, and for being so open and honest with us on this show, and you know, keep fighting the good fight, because you're doing some incredible work for all of us.
Thanks, Bree. I love your work too, and thanks to everyone who joined in as well. Love to see your comments.
And we'll see you all next week, hopefully with another guest. So please keep tuning in, and as I said, sending in your suggestions for guests or topics. We're always keen to hear them. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lisa.
See you guys.